going to give you just my initial impressions of what happened in this election. There will be much more thinking as the weeks go by. We don't even know who has won the House or the Senate yet. So obviously, this is really preliminary. But what we know is these elections were incredibly close. And when things are incredibly close, it means that the work that's done on the ground, the get out the vote, the knocking the doors, the making the phone calls, that's what makes the difference, that field game. And so, that makes me feel really good about Crimson Goes Blue and what we did and what all of you did. I think it also speaks to the fact that now that our country is so polarized, there really are just a few places that are going to make the difference. There are just a few toss-up races. The Cook Political Report there, the way they divided up the races, every single race for Senate or governor that they put as lean or likely Democrat or Republican went that way. And it was only the toss-up races that could go either way. The other thing that was new to me, but I've learned this election, is that when you have toss-up races, let's say you have 50 toss-up races, they're not likely to divide 25-25. There is usually a way the toss-up races trend. And so this time the toss-up races trended towards Democrats. And I think, in the week before the election, as people got so nervous and were sort of spreading this really dark, like, oh, the Democrats are going to blow it again, I think had to do with a couple things. The polls really were pretty accurate. I think people were nervous that they wouldn't be. And they were also nervous to not rely on what is called the fundamentals, not rely on the usual things that we expect in a midterm, namely that the president's party does terribly, that it's a referendum on the current president. And even though it seemed obvious to me, at least, that this was no ordinary midterm, it did seem, partly because of Trump really staying in the game, that it was an us versus them election. It wasn't just a referendum on Biden, because we had this other guy still there. And if you can say anything, it was a terrible night for Trump on election night. I mean, really, in all the swing places, the candidates that he got in there did really badly. So that's good news, I think, for our democracy. It is where, these issues like abortion and democracy really played out on our side in the states where those things were really vulnerable, right? So where democracy was threatened by these election deniers and where abortion rights might go down, those states really voted for Democrats. When you look at some of the other states like New York, where we lost a bunch of congressional races, those states like New York behaved more like a typical midterm, right? Where the party in power lost seats. But even though the surveys kind of said that, oh, Americans care about inflation as the number one issue, I do think that even though they may say that inflation was the number one issue, that didn't mean that they thought the Republicans were the answer to that. And it also didn't mean when they got in the voting booth, it was the primary thing that they voted about. I think I said this analogy earlier today, like if someone asked me, well, what's more important, abortion rights or starving people, right? I might say, well, starving people, of course, we got to feed starving people. But in truth, when I get in the ballot box, I'm way more likely to vote around abortion than I am about hunger. I mean, I don't know what that says about me, but I think a lot of people, that's what happened when they got in the voting booth. I think it also, the results really speak to the fact that the anti-MAGA voting force is very, very powerful and very, very big. And it's been the biggest political movement in the last couple of elections. And it seems to remain that. People really do not like the kind of extremism that the MAGA Republicans have brought. So I think the polls were right. The pundits were afraid of straying too far from the fundamentals, and so they assumed the polls were wrong, but really they were pretty good. The other things that happened that were a little unexpected is that the youth vote turned out in big numbers, and I don't know why the polls were unable to capture that, but people thought they weren't going to show up, and they did. Women showed up in huge numbers. They always show up in bigger numbers than the men, but they really did. And I think the hypocrisy of Republicans talking about freedom but actually taking away people's rights really hit home for a lot of voters. So I think the other things we can say is that the Senate right now, the Republicans have won 49, we've won 48. There's 3 elections out there: Arizona, Nevada, and the Georgia runoff. From the looks of it, the more likely outcome is that we're going to win Nevada and Arizona, because the votes that are still out there are much more likely to break for us. That would be so awesome, because then we can work on Georgia. Georgia will be gravy if we win it, but we would still have the majority. And I also think that winning Georgia will be much more likely if we have already won the majority, because there are a lot of Republicans who really, really don't want to vote for Herschel Walker, but they might do it if it was the difference between holding the majority or not. If it's no longer that, I think a lot of them won't show up. So the other thing in terms of the House, right now, the Republicans are basically at very near to 218, the magic number to have the majority, and we're at around 208. If you look at the races that are likely to go Democrat and the races that are likely to go Republican, and then there's kind of about 9 races left that seem like true toss-ups. We may not know the results of those for days. California is very slow in getting the votes in. The one other thing I'll say is that it seems like independents did break towards the Democrats in this election. That is very unusual in a midterm when you've got a president with such low approval ratings and you've got the inflation that we have. So this really was an unusual election, but it may turn out to be the norm going forward. And the 2 things that I think seem like they're going to be here for a long time are much higher turnout than used to happen. Both sides are really energized because they hate the other side so much. So the base really turns out. And so the idea that, midterms are all about turnout, and, they still sort of are, but it's not because there's such low turnout. I mean, it's lower than the presidential, but it's been really high the last couple times. And I think the other thing that will remain is that early voting and voting by mail are just something people have now grown accustomed to, the convenience of it. People really like it. That helps our side, and I think it's here to stay. People are voting over weeks and they've gotten used to it, and I think that's going to be hard to pull back, which does increase turnout as well. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I'll take any questions.